Different bodies, different minds, incredible passion and a touch of magic in their eyes. They move silently, often ignored by society, but they paint our realities. They move us, they inspire us, they brighten our days if we just acknowledge them. They are the differently abled. Let's celebrate their lives and listen to their stories.
This is part of our ongoing podcast series with the Orion organization out in Atlantis. Today I have Kerry Delport, the Director of Autism Western Cape, and as I've just said, we're probably going to be talking about autism today. How are you, Kerry?
Great, thanks. How are you, Nick?
I'm fine. It's nice to chat. So normally we talk to people with the said disability or someone who's involved in their life that has the said disability. Do you know anyone with autism?
Oh, so many. too many to count on all my limbs.
Okay, so we'll get into that later. It's nice to chat today. So we need to discuss what autism is. So can you explain the autism spectrum disorders?
So autism is a condition that impacts the way the brain processes information. So, a lot of people consider it a disorder with a lot of deficits, and it's actually just a different way of thinking, and as a result, a different way of acting and responding to the world. So, for example, some people have iPhones, some people have Samsung, some people have Nokias, and all the phones work very, very differently, but they all work. And so autism, it just impacts the way the brain operates. And so they process information differently. It affects four main areas of development, language and communication being one of them. Social interaction, so how people engage and relate to other people is the second area. Then behavior and thinking is impacted. That's the third area. And that's kind of, when we look at behavior, some of those stereotypical things that we might see, hand flapping, tendencies that are very similar to OCD, and that kind of thing, a kind of quite, don't want to say narrow focused interest, but a very focused interest on particular things. And then the fourth area is sensory processing or sensory modulation, and that's where a lot of autistic people struggle to process the information we take in through our senses, so sound, light, touch, taste, smell, but then also balance, and then something called proprioception, which is just your muscles and joints and where your body is in space. So they'll struggle to process that, and so for an autistic person, what will be normal noise for us can be too much for them. It can almost sound like a pounding, loud, overwhelming noise, and so they can become overstimulated quite easily through that kind of impact as well. So, all of those areas are impacted, which then impacts functioning. But on a whole level, they're quite capable of doing what all of us are doing. Important is that they're all unique. So if you know one person with autism, you know one, and if you know two, you know two. No one is going to be the same as the other.
We also need to add in that there is, as I said at the beginning, there's a spectrum. Different people lie in different areas of the spectrum. Absolutely. Some are very functional and are, for all intents and purposes, just like everyone else. And some people are not. Some people have, for lack of a better term, severe disabilities from their autism, and they basically can't run a normal life because whatever the autism forces them to focus on, that basically consumes them.
Absolutely. It's kind of, we put it on a spectrum of high support need to low support need, where those with low support need cope quite fine in society and they can go to mainstream schools, and they manage to be included and they get appropriate jobs. And then you get those with high support needs who may be nonverbal, who may have quite serious learning challenges, and who might need more intensive support or facilitated support as they get older. It's really hard to look at someone who's autistic and to put them on a kind of area of the spectrum as we would look at it. For example, I met a young guy recently in Mossel Bay who's 12, And he looks like your stereotypical Hollywood version of autism, where he's nonverbal, he bangs his head, he has to wear his earphones all the time, he can't communicate using his words, so he's got no words at all. But then when I chatted to his teachers, he communicates through type, and he's more fluent than you and I speaking. And he's actually accessing the Cambridge curriculum at a year ahead of where his peers are. So it's so hard to look at people on the spectrum and to decide where they are, because the development is so spiked. It's so varied, and while one person might not have verbal speech, they've still got so much to say. Just they weren't communicated in the way we would. So it's really difficult for us to place people where they would be on the spectrum. So what we do is we just talk about what is their level of support need, so that rather than putting them in a box, we're basically putting an action on ourselves as to, well, what do I need to do to get you or to support you in getting your full level of functioning, or your full level of inclusion in society? How do I need to help you, as opposed to, well, what are you capable of, and I'm just going to get you to there, which is quite a nice, refreshing way of looking at it, because they're capable of so much.
Just a question on that child. You said he doesn't communicate with words, but he obviously types and does communicate with people. Does he choose not to communicate via words? He just doesn't like it, or is he just not able to do it? I'm just trying to understand here.
So there's two things around that. You get autistic people who choose not to, where verbal speech just isn't their preferred version of communicating. And I think if chatting to an autistic person would definitely give you more insight on that. But then you get nonverbal autistics who have what's also called speech dyspraxia. And what happens there is that they know in their head or in their brain what they want to say, but getting their mouth to coordinate that into speech is very difficult for them. And so they can never get what they want to say out. And it just causes a lot of frustration. And so they can't form words to speak, but they know exactly what they want to say. So their understanding is crystal clear. Just their expression of speech isn't there.
Just some general questions. Autism develops in childhood, am I right? It's not like you're 20 or 25 and then suddenly it happens.
No,
it always
absolutely.
happens when you're young.
So it's a lifelong, starts in childhood. You do get adults who will go undiagnosed because they might have, I say it very cautiously, very mild autism or kind of very subtle traits of autism, and then they only get diagnosed in adulthood, but that they've been there their whole life. But yeah, it's a childhood. It's not something that comes in adulthood. It comes normally before the age of 3. You can start seeing it.
And what are some signs? Because I know you were talking to Ingrid beforehand, who's my boss, and she was saying sometimes she thinks I'm autistic. And I have my quirks. I won't lie. I do have them, but I don't think I'm autistic. I am introverted, and I certainly have certain signs, but I wouldn't consider myself in any way autistic. But how do you know? What's the process about getting diagnosed?
So I suppose, certain things to look out for, especially in young children, are things like lack of eye contact or not being able to look into the eyes. Autistic people often find while they can make eye contact, they find it very uncomfortable. And so a lot of them won't make eye contact. So that's something to look out for in children, together with either not speaking by a certain age, normally by about the age of 3 if they're not using any words, or if the way that they're communicating is very different. So some things you might look out for is where if your child only ever speaks when you speak. So if you say to your child, do you want potatoes? And they say, do you want potatoes? That's not really them speaking. They're echoing what you're doing, something called echolalia. That would be something to look out for. So the fact that they might have words, but they're not using it, or the only way they communicate is through kind of regurgitating what they've heard on television or radio or the iPad. That kind of speech development is very different, so very different development of speech. Other things you would look out for when they have very kind of specific interests. A lot of people would call them narrow focused interests, where they, have specific things that they target, and that kind of holds their attention for a long time, and often to a degree that they might become distressed at moving away from that. So some children, for example, might be obsessively interested in trains. And everything they want to do is around trains, and they struggle to break away from the fact that, well, there are other things available other than trains. You can look out for things like children not engaging with other children or playing with other children, where they might seem to choose to play on their own or prefer isolated play. Look for things like inappropriate play with toys or repetitive play with toys or objects. You would look for, there's some stereotypical behaviors that you could look out for, and that will be things like hand flapping, opening and closing doors continuously, flipping light switches on and off, maybe blocking their ears, maybe humming, walking on toes, those kind of idiosyncratic type behaviors, the ones that are just unusual for us to take notice of. And then looking for things like sensory processing challenges, where a noise might throw them off, or going into a place that's loud might make them distressed, like a shopping center. And having things that might look like tantrums but are actually meltdowns because they're just overstimulated or overwhelmed by what is going on around them. So those are some of the things that you can look out for.
Now, how many people does this affect? Because I read a stat somewhere that said 1 in 68, but it also that also
Yes.
needs to be explained, because it affects males much more than females.
Absolutely. So the global statistic is 1 in 68, and with that, it affecting boys 4 to 5 times more than it affects girls. So within that stat, you could break it down and have 1 in 42 boys on the spectrum, and 1 in 189 or so girls impacted by autism. I read a stat very recently in terms of South Africa, saying that 2% of South Africans are impacted by autism. And just out of interest sakes, I went on to look at our population and did a little calculation, and it's 1,059,000 people in South Africa who are sitting somewhere on the autism spectrum.
And why does it affect men more than women? I assume that must be genetic reasons, something to do with the the
I
X
think
chromosome.
so. I think, there probably is partly a genetic component in there. I honestly think, I know quite a lot of women who are autistic, and we collaborate quite a lot with them. I think in women is often where we see it diagnosed later, and the way autism shows in girls is very different to boys. And I think partly because girls naturally normally have a slightly more advanced language development than boys do when they're younger, that they tend to slip under the radar a lot more and get a diagnosis later. So I think that might be part of the reason. And yeah, possibly genetics being another aspect of that.
Kerry, I've got one last thing before I let you go. I want to know, how do we get in contact with Autism Western Cape, and what do you guys do?
So, we do a range of stuff. So basically, we're a nonprofit that exists for supporting autistics themselves, so people diagnosed with autism or suspecting a diagnosis of autism, as well as families and communities. We work a lot, we're non-discriminatory. So whether you live in a poor community or whether you live in Bishop's Court and you're impacted by autism, we support everyone, and our work entails anything from post-diagnosis support to general counseling and psychoeducational services. We run parent support groups. We run social groups for adults on the autism spectrum. We do training and workshops around what autism is and how to engage with it and understanding the behavior. And we do school support for schools on how do you include and how do you work appropriately with autistic children, as opposed to just shoving them in the corner of a classroom and calling that education. So we kind of work a lot with schools around that as well. And then we focus a lot on parent empowerment and general advocacy around the rights of autistic children, especially the right to an education. We're sitting with a 3 to 6 year waiting list in the Western Cape for autistic children to get into schools. So we advocate a lot around that right to an education. So yeah, parents, families, communities, schools, anyone can contact us, and we're happy to work with anyone. A number of ways. They can either go to our website, so www.autismwesterncape.org.za, obviously all one word, or they can pop us an email. I'll give you our general admin email. It's admin@awc.org.za, and from there they can ask for whatever kind of support they want, and then it generally gets shifted to the appropriate staff member. Otherwise, they can phone us on 021-685-9581, and then there's always Facebook. So we have an Autism Western Cape Facebook page that's very, very active. And they can join us on that community as well and be kept up to date with everything that's happening.
Carrie, thank you so much for your time today.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick.
Orion Organization, creating futures for people with disabilities through the provision of professional, therapeutic and development services. You can go to their website, orionorganization.org, or you can find them on Facebook and Twitter.